Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Tim Palmer, and coming up today, Tony Abbott's Afghanistan gaffe. Will his reaction to a reporter's question damage him? The federal government facing a backlash from the states, and why a jet ski safety campaign has sparked a racism row. Our panel tonight, Radio National breakfast host Fran Kelly, social commentator and author Jane Caro, and in Melbourne, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs. Thanks all for being with us on The Drum. Well, Fran Kelly, Tony Abbott must have started this first week back in Canberra thinking it would be spent slowly chipping away at Labor's proposed flood levy. As they say in politics, though, the narrative quickly changed. A report on Channel 7's news last night broadcast comments he made while visiting troops in Afghanistan last October after the death of Australian soldier Jared McKinney.
Absolutely. But we all live in knowledge. But all the stuff you see here and more was available in the guys. It's really obvious that shit happened.
Well, the opposition leader was accused of being insensitive. The dead soldier's father described him as ignorant and uncaring, but it was the way he reacted to reporter Mark Riley's question that really has people talking, and it certainly was compelling, if uncomfortable, viewing.
Yeah, look, you've taken this out of context. You weren't there. I would never seek to make light of the death of an Australian soldier.
But I'm not turning into media circus. I'm showing you vision of your reaction to his explanation about what happened on the day in the operation in which McKinney was killed. How's that turning into a media circus? Okay, well, tell me, what's the context? And if it's out of context, what is the context? You're not saying anything, Tony.
I've given you the response you deserve.
Cringeworthy. Mr Abbott's colleagues were quick to defend their leader, crying media ambush.
Tony was trying to console these soldiers who felt obviously, desperate about the loss of one of their colleagues. And it was a very human reaction, I thought, and a serious attempt in the vernacular. He was really saying this was an unavoidable tragedy.
I want to call on Kerry Stokes to do something about the disgraceful reporting by Channel 7 and Mark Riley in particular on this issue, because I think it needs to be dealt with. It's just a dirtbag reporting, and unless Channel 7 does something about this sort of disgraceful ambush, they should hang their heads in shame.
Well, Fran Kelly, there really are two quite separate elements to this episode, aren't there? There's the initial comment made in Afghanistan, and that's divided opinion over whether it's insensitive or quite reasonable. But then there's the response in the Channel 7 interview, which even Mr Abbott's defenders seem to find a little more difficult to explain.
And I think the response, Tony Abbott's response for him politically, in a longer-term sense, is the more serious part of this story for him in political terms.
Why?
Well, because it goes to his reactions as a leader, his political instincts and his political judgments, as it did when he chose... remember last year when the original story about him not going to Afghanistan with Julia Gillard broke, and he said he didn't want to go when he was jet-lagged because he had to go to Britain for that Tory conference? Well, that was a terrible thing to say, and it unleashed a storm of criticism, rightful criticism against him. But then it turns out that wasn't the reason, and he just knew he had to say something, and he couldn't say he was planning to go in a few weeks. That was a bad judgment call. This was a bad judgment call in the sense, in my view, Tony Abbott was briefed, his office was briefed on this story, as I understand it. He wasn't ambushed, as Andrew Robb and others have said. His office was given 2.5 hours notice of the story, what the story was, what the tape showed. That's presumably why Tony Abbott agreed to come down and do the interview. I think there's a judgment question myself on why he decided to walk right into the ring of the media circus in that way. He could have controlled it more, and good media management would have had him control it more. And then why he didn't have a good, strong line beyond, this is out of context. Well, yes, this is out of context, so then follow up. Why not say something like, look, I was there talking to soldiers. This language is nothing there. What I was doing was shoring them up, which he did say. But of course, what I was trying to say was not to make light of the death, but to put it in a context and make it clear that, you know, tragic and horrible things happen inevitably in war.
All sounds very good presented now on the spot, but let me take you back to what you said at first then, because the criticisms of Tony Abbott, such as those comments in London, was that he couldn't stop saying what he thought, that things just leapt out of his mouth. Here, you could argue he's restrained himself. He calls it a dignified silence.
But that's the point, isn't it? It was there was nothing dignified about that. It was uncomfortable. You could feel every, you know, element, molecule of his body wanting to sort of spring out to his defence or to something more aggressive than that. So I don't know that it was a dignified silence. It was an uncomfortable silence, and that's what I mean. He knew this was going. He knew what he was going to be faced with. Why didn't he know clearly what his lines and explanation were? It's clearly explicable. Anyone watching it, I think, beyond perhaps immediately family members, would not think that was an insensitive response. They would understand what was going on. He was trying to make those soldiers in the field feel a bit better about the fact that things clearly went wrong. As the commander said, you know, the execution could have gone better. Well, that's for sure. He was clearly trying to reassure them. It's defensible, but he did not have a defence plan, and that's what I think is inexplicable.
Jane Caro, can I ask, did you feel that every second that ticked away there during that dignified silence was damaging Tony Abbott or not?
Oh, totally. Oh, yes. In fact, I think it's very serious. It's not so much that he didn't know what to say, although that's part of it, but if you think that 80% of what we communicate is our body language, he was shaking. He's standing there and he's actually shaking, visibly shaking. There's something strange going on. I've seen another clip where we actually look at his face as he's looking at the reporter, full on rather than the side-on clip. He looks like a broken man. I mean, there's something, I felt, for the first time in my life, I felt sorry for Tony Abbott. He looked like he really was going through something where he was lost. And as you say, Fran, that's not what we want to see in our leaders. I wanted him even to
what's
say...
wrong there? The lack of composure, or what is it you're marking him down for?
It's what Fran said, the unpreparedness, not knowing, having a line that he can cover his confusion with. I mean, I would have thought that was just what
No,
you've
we're all
got to do.
human, and he presumably, I haven't seen the head-on shot and I'd love to, but presumably it's about thinking, oh my God, I meant no offence here, this is awful, I don't want to cause offence about the death of an Australian soldier, how do I remedy this, how do I move this? I mean, that's presumably his discomfort.
One assumes so, but he looks completely as if... I mean, maybe he had a brain freeze, and we've all had them. He just went blank and couldn't think of anything to say.
Chris Berg, did you see it live? Can I ask you, let's talk about both elements. What's your view? Is there an element of insensitivity in the original comment? And did he respond reasonably during the interview?
No, I think it was actually, and this wasn't entirely clear last night, but it's become very clear this morning that what he said was mundane at best. It was a reaction not to the death of the soldier, but to the incomprehensibility of a battlefield more than anything else. He wasn't talking about, well, shit happens, soldiers die. It's more shit happens, bad things occur sometimes on the battlefield, and those can have absolutely tragic consequences. Now, I don't think this will be as politically damaging for Tony Abbott as my co-panellists suggest, and part of it is because of the Tony Abbott's stunning reaction. He looks absolutely astonished. Now, we don't want to read too much. We don't want to try to read too much into what Tony Abbott was thinking in those excruciating moments. But that sheer astonishment, I think, underlines the political game that Channel 7 was playing. Bear in mind, if this had been a real scoop, if they'd actually caught him saying something really, truly horrendous, they wouldn't have needed to pull him up in the middle of the Parliamentary House courtyard and show him video.
Hang on, Chris, they didn't pull him up. He was, according to Mark Riley, I haven't spoken to Mark, but according to things he said on air this morning, Abbott's minder, his advisor, was briefed 2.5 hours earlier on the content of the tape, on the content of the conversation.
And it's not that might be true, but it isn't entirely clear. It's not necessarily an ambush for the minder, but it's not entirely necessarily true, I should say, for Tony Abbott, because you and I both watched that footage and we know he doesn't know what to say. They haven't thought about it. So I'm not going to take Mark Riley's word on how he briefed or what email he may have sent at any one time. clearly Tony Abbott.
Or whether Tony Abbott's mind had properly briefed him.
There's a lot of attack on Channel 7 for this, and in my view, I think the only criticism I would level at Channel 7 is that the day they chose to do it. I think it is insensitive to run that on the day when the Parliament is focused on a condolence motion for the flood victims. I think they should have left it today.
Fran, the footage they showed was deliberately misleading.
But Chris, if as a journalist, if I saw that footage, no one else
you
had seen it,
mislead? You know
I would have found a way to use the footage. Was it deliberately misleading? I wasn't misled.
I didn't find it terribly out of context, I must say myself. Jane, did you think you needed more context?
No. I actually thought that the original statement was perfectly reasonable. I understood exactly what Tony Abbott was saying. He was saying to them, don't blame yourselves.
Yeah.
You know, war is hell, basically, and terrible things can happen.
We accept that vernacular, do we? Generally, all three on the panel. It seems that you do.
Yeah, that's right.
Totally. I would, but if I was his dad, I would probably be hurt by it initially. But I think maybe it got a turbocharge because of the context, because don't forget, the news hound in Mark Riley or any of us would remember that Tony Abbott, just before he went over there, was questioning whether off the back of that email, anonymous email from an Australian soldier, questioning whether there was the support, the backup support for the soldiers caught in that skirmish, which turned deadly.
But talking about the vernacular, it has become a bit of a habit of politicians, male politicians, going over there, and Philip Curry's written about this today in the Herald, to start talking or start swearing like troopers when they're amongst the troopers, as he wrote. Kevin Rudd, we know, talked to the troops on one of his last visits there, saying it was shit weather, and the next day, you guys really know you're shit.
Kevin
not his normal way of talking, I wouldn't imagine.
It's a bit more normal for Tony Abbott. I don't know which circles you mix in, Tim, but it's pretty normal in the ones I'm in.
But it is a bit more normal for Tony Abbott, but I also can't help thinking, what would have happened if Julia Gillard had come out with that language? Would the coalition have moved on that? And I think they would have. I also wonder if there's not just, the antenna wasn't awakened, Riley's and others' antenna, is there not a faint echo of, Rumsfeld's stuff happens? That was a storm around that at the time. Rumsfeld was really only doing the same thing, pointing out the obvious.
But I think a bigger issue here too is that we've gotten to a point now, Tony Abbott is actually a very articulate, very good communicator. He's actually one of the better communicators, I think, that we have in politics at the moment. He does make you feel like there's a human being behind what he's saying. So we've now gotten to the point in politics where something like that comes up and a smart, fast on his feet thinker like Tony Abbott lacks the confidence in the way we present our politicians now and the way the media deals with it and the way people are judged and how we're waiting for any minor gaffe. And so he stands there, and you're absolutely right. What's going through his head is, oh my God, I said that, I did say that. What am I going to say? How